Hi, everyone. It's Amy Campbell and Carlin Crow from the Iowa Developmental Disabilities Council back for our weekly Capital Snapshot. And this week we got a special treat. We were able to have a discussion about some of the reorganization discussions that have been going on this week, and really have an opportunity to learn a little bit more about some of the things that I think both I missed when I read it the first time, Carlin.
Yeah, we have talked in previous chats about the state reorganization bill and all the proposals in it, and the fact that it's 1,500 pages long and a lot for a lot of people to get through. So there was a particular subcommittee meeting that happened last Monday that had some implications for people with disabilities, and some things that happened during the meeting that made it apparent that our state is not really well prepared in some aspects of being accessible to everyone, and at the times that it's most important. So we invited today Sarah Young Bear Brown, who is actually on our the DD Council's Allies and Advocacy Committee that's working on looking at what policies we should be working on behalf of people with disabilities. And she was trying to be an advocate last Monday in the subcommittee meeting, and because she's deaf, needed an interpreter to be with her at the meeting, and the interpreter was not able to have her video turned on so that Sarah could participate in the meeting. So as a result of that, and the meeting was about the reorganization of the Department for the Blind, and there were a number of people from the blind community in the room for the subcommittee meeting that gave great testimony, but it was also a little bit not organized well, and so there was a lot of confusion in the room as to who was going to talk and when, and it was not, again, made very accessible for the people who were in the room. So that made it apparent that our state needs to do better when it comes to being accessible, and we've all recognized that Zoom is a great option for us to get an inside, what's going on in the legislature, and we've, as public, been invited to more meetings or been able to participate because of Zoom or WebEx that they're using to be able to participate in meetings. But this made it apparent that it's not quite accessible for everybody who needs to be there. So we invited Sarah Young Brown to talk to us today, and she told us a lot about what she's working on and her concerns about the state reorganization.
Yeah, the reorganization has a couple things in it related to the Department of Education that you're watching. So the move of vocational rehabilitation from education to workforce development. You mentioned the commission for the blind, and the making them less autonomous and moving them in as a governor appointee. And then I know Sarah was really also concerned about some changes with moving the school for the deaf and the Braille and Sight Saving School under the Department of Education from Board of Regents, and in so doing also lost a pretty lengthy process that the state is required to go through, including legislative approval before they merge or close one of those schools. Is eliminated. So I think there was a lot in that portion of the bill that just didn't register when you first read it. And then to compound the issue that it was hidden in a 1,500-page bill is that the subcommittees were not accessible to the communities that are most affected by that change. So I'm really happy we have Sarah here with us to talk about it.
Yeah, let's listen to what Sarah has to say, and also just wanted to point out that, one of the issues that really hit home was as a result of this meeting and their testimony and the thing that we really advocate for as the DD Council is that members of the disability community not only need to be involved in these decisions and asked the best way of handling things, they need to be in a leadership position because they're best able to lead and advocate on behalf of themselves and their lived experiences. And that's part of our mission, and it's very much what she talks about in our interview today. I think one of the reasons we wanted to talk about it is when they were talking about the Department of the Blind and what's going to happen in reorganization, it became clear to at least one of the senators in the room that the state is not doing a very good job with making itself accessible to everyone. And it was demonstrated by how poorly organized that Zoom call and meeting were. So that was something that kind of sparked interest for us, because one of the ways we talk about inclusion and including people with disabilities is that we want them to be able to advocate and lead for issues and policies that affect them directly. So it resonated with our mission, and the things that you commented on afterwards were very telling about how things did not go as they should have for accessibility.
Yeah,
So I think
I also was really interested in the discussion about the elimination of the language that required the state to go through certain steps to close the school for the deaf. And that was something I missed in the original reading of the bill, because it was just a struck section. I can't talk this morning. And I didn't realize that the state had a pretty lengthy process it had to go through before it could close or merge the schools. So I thought that was a really interesting discussion as well during that breakout session.
So I had posted on Twitter to speak out about the bill on different social media things, because I mean, the document itself is just enormous and almost impossible for a regular person to be able to navigate. So looking at all of the different changes that they were going to make and all of the different restructuring that would remove a lot of power from different communities. And I thought that that was wrong, that I just strongly disagree that that should happen. And so one of the big concerns specifically with that is that if that bill were to pass and become law, then what would be the long-term implications for that? Because of course we've got the governor is in this current governor is in office now, but if they change this bill, then this is going to be something that will be in place for future administrations, and we don't know what their thought process is going to be. So removing protections is not going to be something that long term is going to necessarily guarantee that no other changes will happen, as she has promised that nothing else will be changing. Also, moving it under the Department of Education just because it's K through 12 is different, because the state of Iowa has a lot of problems with finding enough quality sign language interpreters to work within the classrooms for the different public schools around the state to accommodate deaf and hard of hearing children. And for example, there was an interpreter who was working with a deaf student from excuse me, for a school district that had a deaf program, and there were 12 students there, and they had one interpreter to cover all of those 12 students. So of course there's no way that they can possibly be providing accommodation for those students, for all 12 students, with one person. And that was a variety of age ranges as well. So this person was expected to interpret for a kindergartner all the way up through a sixth grader, and that age range difference and the difference of requirements and skill and qualification, relationship with the classroom teachers, IEP requirements for these students is so varied, and they only have one interpreter doing that. So removing ISD as an option is going to just put more students in a situation where they're going to be looking to need interpreters, and there's already a shortage. So that's just a couple of reasons why I strongly oppose the bill, because of the long-term implications of how it's going to impact deaf education and deaf children, and then ultimately deaf adults who will be living in our states after they've gone through the educational system here that we're providing for them. And on top of that, ISD is it's one of the few places in Iowa where deaf children have the ability to have peers who are like them instead of being sometimes the only deaf person that is in their entire community or in their entire district. And so having those role models, having peer relationships, having access to all that the school can provide, like sports teams, and uh, that's not something that they would be able to necessarily have the opportunity for, along with all of the resources that they have at ISD, if they were to go to their local public school. There's also classes and outreach that ISD provides for family support that's specific to and designed by people who understand what it means to work with parents who have a deaf or hard of hearing child, or even a deaf blind child. And the school districts or AEAs aren't going to have that amount of resource. So the concern isn't just that, this governor has promised that things won't change. It's that the law is going to change, and what's going to happen down the road when new administration comes in and they have an easier time with removing those resources or closing down the school. And, as myself as a deaf person, as well as having a deaf child on my own, and seeing how the experience of being at a local public school versus having brought her to ISD in the last year or two, and the change in her and just her self-confidence, her engagement with her academics, her friendships, was something that she wasn't getting at public schools. And I just think that it's dangerous to remove that opportunity for deaf children. And so we're setting a bad precedent. And then I also had wanted to bring up the point, what I originally attended the subcommittee meeting was I wanted to bring up the point about LRE, the least restrictive environment mandate that's within the IDEA law. And that's really, if you think about children with different disabilities, like children who have mobility issues, or who are autistic, or who need different supports with maybe accessing the physical classroom or accessing a classroom that really they just need to have some different accommodations that they can access the same education and everything. But there's no language difference, there's no cultural difference, there's no sensory access issues. Uh, that's different than what a deaf child needs. So in the deaf community, we talk about LRE as meaning a language-rich environment. And when you have a deaf child who's in a public school and they're the only person that uses sign language, they're the only person who accesses the world visually, and maybe the only adult that's around them is a sign language interpreter who may or may not be qualified to work in deaf education, which is a different field than interpreting, they're going to be missing out on that language-rich environment. They're also already experiencing language deprivation, oftentimes because they're born into families where nobody else uses sign language. They don't know how to work with deaf people. And so whereas hearing children are getting exposure to language from, day one, deaf children aren't getting that at home. And so they need to have that in their academic environment. Not only that, but they're behind by those several years, so that they need to be caught up with that. So that's another aspect of that.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think you just demonstrated very importantly why it's so crucial that people who are directly impacted by these policies and rules that are being discussed sometimes very minimally by those who are making these policies and rules, need to include those who are being affected, and get this kind of education about why certain policies may not work, that are being discussed, because the people who are proposing them do not have direct experience with it. And having someone like you who has direct lived experience for yourself and your family to help put things in perspective is so important. And that's why your participation as an advocate is crucial for legislators, policymakers, and, you know, regular Iowans to understand the impact of policies that are being suggested, put into bills that are very long, that a lot of people don't understand, and move to vote before all the implications are considered. So thank you so much for sharing
I
that.
agree with you. I posted something on Twitter that talked about, well, I shared the link to that subcommittee meeting, and they IPR, Iowa Public Radio, they had created an article. They did an article or I don't know what you want to call it, an episode, and the representative from IPR had wanted to attend the subcommittee meeting, and we didn't find out about it until Sunday evening. So, and the meeting was Monday morning, so it was sort of last minute, and we really spread the word in the community really quickly. We even reached out to ISD and let them know, because they hadn't been informed that they were going to have that. And we knew that it was too late to request an interpreter because, it's Sunday night and then the next one is Monday morning. So luckily I texted Amber, and she happened to be available just by chance and was willing to volunteer her time to interpret it. So all of these steps that we had to put in place on our own, that we had to take steps to make it accessible, we scrambled and put that all together. We had people attending, and then when we logged into the Zoom, there was no chat function. We could not raise or we could not turn on our camera or unmute our microphone. We used the raise hand feature to try and get the attention of a staffer. I sent a tweet to Sarah Trongariot and asked her if she could reach out to somebody there and let them know that we had an ASL interpreter on screen. Her name said ASL interpreter, as it does now, so it was very clear that she was an interpreter there. The staffer at the Senate replied to Sarah Trongariot and said no, they weren't willing to do that at all. They would not allow anybody to turn on their camera. And I was so upset, because it's like, we want to participate. We have something to say. This impacts us. We scrambled to be able to be here because they didn't let anybody know ahead of time, because they don't have to. And that's another example of it not being accessible. So because I wanted to see what was going on, as well as the other deaf people who were joining, we had to set up a separate video call. We just used like a Facebook Messenger video call, so that we were logged into the Zoom meeting, but we could see what was happening because we had Amber on the second feed. But we wanted to express our concerns, and so they moved on to the DOE stuff, and then they're like, oh, I guess we don't have anybody that wants to make a comment. And nobody let us know ahead of time. There was no transparency. There was no way for us to let people know. The superintendent of the School for the Deaf wasn't even aware that this meeting was going to be happening. So there's no communication with the community at large. There's no communication with the institutions who are going to be impacted, and the communities are going to be impacted. We have a right to participate in this process, and we have a right to express our concerns and oppose legislation that's going to impact us, and that they just outright blocked us at every turn. It almost felt, like intentional, because there was step by step that we had to do a lot of work. And then another thing that happened was I had, like I said, my hand raised virtually. They unmuted my microphone and called on me, but did not open my video. I, of course, do not speak. I use sign language. I don't use spoken language. And the Senator Schultz said, oh, apparently Sarah doesn't want to talk. And then they just moved on. And we had no way of letting them know that, I need my video on. I need to have the interpreter's microphone on, so that she could interpret into English what my comments are. And it was just, it left me feeling disgusted, and I thought it was awful.
Of course. Well, I also know that you're on our Allies and Advocacy group that's talking more about policies we should work on. And are you also involved in other aspects of the DD Council? And I'm asking because I'm new, so I've seen your name, but I don't know all of your involvement.
Yes. So I was recently elected as the chairperson for the Native American Caucus for IDP. And let's see. I advocate with Native deaf community. I'm also a public speaker and inspirational, motivational speaker. I travel across the country doing that as a native deaf person, speaking from that perspective. And then I'm an artist. I do beadwork, and so yeah, I wear several hats, and I'm a mom.
It's a lot.
Yeah, I like to have the different roles. Yeah.
Well, we appreciate your work as an advocate on behalf of people who are deaf and also people with disabilities in general, because it helps that we're all working together to make Iowa hopefully more accessible for people to be able to live and work and play in the communities that they choose and the way that they choose it to do it. That's our goal that we're working towards, and you are sure contributing to that with your advocacy. So we thank you for that.
Really, I just feel that it's very important to do everything that we each can do to work to remove barriers and reduce discrimination and racism and other forms of oppression. And, I feel like it's important for me to do that because I know what it means to have those experiences. And I feel like speaking out against that and sharing what I've been through and how I've navigated that and what I've experienced helps other people who maybe are experiencing similar things but are not advocates themselves or aren't in a position to advocate. So I feel like that's really important to share those stories and to speak out. For example, when there's no ASL interpreter or there's no captioning, sometimes people will say, oh, there's no interpreter, but go ahead and use the captions. But really, my first language is American Sign Language. English is a second language for me. And I prefer to access my community and the world around me in my first language as much as possible, particularly when it's very important and very significant and very high impact. When it's in sign language as well, I can express myself. If there's captioning there, sure, I can maybe access what's going on and what's being said, but how can I express myself and contribute to the conversation and contribute to my community? I can do that through sign language with a sign language interpreter, as well as being able to express myself in my first language and not have to try and write in a second language and communicate that way. So there's a couple of different perspectives there that I think sometimes people overlook when it comes to accessibility.
Absolutely. And thank you for educating us on that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that working as an advocate and educating folks is very important because sometimes there's misunderstanding where they put everyone in sort of into this massive group and they don't really understand all of the varied needs of people within a community. So, thinking about people with disabilities, and within that group, there's so many different needs for accessibility and accommodation. But then even just within the deaf community, there's such a range of different needs for different accommodations. And it depends also on the situation that you're going into. So for example, a deaf person who needs to access their community, their medical care through a sign language interpreter, and how important it is to have a live interpreter. And what I mean by live is meaning the interpreter's there in the room with you and not using a virtual interpreter who's, there on a screen, and you're talking about very sensitive and important information and health information, and you're accessing it through this technology that not only may not work smoothly if the Wi-Fi connection isn't good, but it's a tiny little screen sometimes. If a person is immobilized, maybe you're in labor, you're giving birth and you have a little iPad off to the side that you have to turn your head to see the interpreter to get the instruction and communicate with your medical team. Or if somebody has visual issues as well as being deaf and they're maybe low vision or deaf blind, and that's just not accessible. So talking about all of those different ways that accommodation needs to happen that really depends on the person, I think is something that's an important conversation to advocate around as well.
For more information about bills and where they're moving and what else is going on at the Capitol, Amy put together a wonderful infonet this week, so please check your email for that or our website and for more details on bills specifically. And then join us on Friday for Capitol Chat at 11 o'clock. And we're going to talk about some recommendations made for changes in Medicaid and mental health and disability services across the state. So we'll have an expert there to talk about that. So please join us for Capitol Chat.
see you next week.